launch right into the question that's driving this research that the talk is based on. And the question is as follows. Why did U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt insist during World War II that China should be one of the four great powers, the fourth policeman, or one of the four policemen as he called it in the post-war World War? That's the question that puzzled me. Now, if you read even a few pages into any book on American policy in World War II, you'll quickly discover, I'm sure all of you know, that the four policemen were at the center of what FDR envisioned would be the international order that would keep the peace after the war. That's in any textbook, and the next sentence in all of those textbooks are the four policemen were the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China. And then typically the authors or authors go on to other things, leaving, I think, an important question unasked, and that is namely, why China? The literature is actually quite sparse. To the extent that the question is even entertained at all, it tends to be dismissed with one or another explanation that isn't very well thought out. I'll list the most common ones in a minute, and I'll tell you why I don't think they really hold much water. But what really struck me when I started looking into this is why the question hasn't even, not just been answered to my satisfaction, but hasn't even been asked in any serious way up until this point. Why is China one of these four great powers that FDR wants to place at the center of global power in the post-war world? So the first thing I'm going to try to do is convince you that this is really a puzzle, that this isn't self-evident, because most of the literature does treat it as self-evident, as something we don't really need to look very carefully into, because it would have been obvious, or it should be obvious, why FDR did. That's the first thing I'll try to convince you, that it's not obvious, that it is something that we need to look into. The second is, I'll go briefly over the common explanations such as they are, and briefly note, not to get too much into that, briefly note where I think their problems are, why they don't convince me. And then I'll present a new framework for understanding FDR's insistence, I should say persistent insistence, that China must be one of the four policemen, must be one of the four great powers to be at the center of this global order. And I'll talk a bit about why I think this is a far more convincing explanation than anything I've seen so far in the literature. I should warn you, and I guess it's not on that slide, some other slide, that there isn't a smoking gun document that I found that FDR says this is why I want China to be at the fourth policeman. 1, 2, 3. This is more a story. The story that I'll tell you is more a story, I think, as most interesting historical stories are, about connecting the dots, about seeing policies, seeing the behavior of the decision maker, and trying to figure out what is the best explanation that accounts for everything that we see. And I won't be able to tell you everything that I see, but I'll focus on what I think are the most important dots in this story. I hope I'll convince you at least that if this is not, if I won't convince you that this is the only possible explanation, at least I hope I'll convince you this is a plausible explanation, the best one I've seen so far. So first of all, why is it a puzzle? Well, first of all, it might be hard to remember from our perspective in 2013 when it seems obvious that China is a great world power. That in the 1940s, in 1941, the United States joins the war, China had not been treated as a world power, as a great power in international affairs for at least a century, for at least since the First Opium War, which I'm sure you know began in 1839. So we have here a century of very literally treating China, the great powers treating China as, and this is how the term that was often used, a small nation. Small not in territory, small not in population size, but small in stature in the international hierarchy. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, number two is that FDR persisted in this pursuit against very significant headwinds. There were actually headwinds within his administration, but the ones I'll focus on here are the headwinds from his other allies. Both Churchill and Stalin were vehemently opposed, for different reasons, to this idea of promoting China into great power ranks. And yet FDR, and I'll show you this in a minute, spent quite a bit of capital vis-a-vis these two important allies in order to get them to agree to this promotion. Number three is, and this might strike you as surprising, even with his Chinese ally, this particular idea that China should be one of the four policemen didn't go very far. There are lots of things that FDR did during the war to keep Chiang Kai-shek happy, but this particular idea was not something that Chiang was terribly interested in. And so I think that if you're trying to explain this by FDR was doing this because he was trying to keep the Chinese happy, you just don't get very far. The evidence is just not there. And finally, I've discovered, and I'm convinced that FDR's pursuit of this idea was he pursued it both early and often. So this was not some kind of trial balloon that he floated to see what people will say. He was wont to do these kinds of things. It's not been beyond him, but I'm convinced that this was not one of these trial balloons. And this was not sort of some passing flight of fancy that he might have come up with at some point and then abandoned. This was something that comes up very early on, almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, and he consistently stays with this idea really to his death in the spring of 1945. So all these things together, I think, make it a puzzle that require explanation. What are some of the existing explanations that we find in literature? Some of them are actually, I mean, if you go through literature, it's not, most often you find these explanations not as saying, well, it's a question why China was included, therefore let us tell you, why we think that is. It's more of a kind of aside. If you look at, Kissinger's on diplomacy, he says, well, there were these four policemen, these were the four policemen, China was there because FDR wanted to be nice to China. And also there's something about East Asian strategy. And then he goes on to other things. Half a sentence that he devotes to this question. Again, treating it as if, we all know why this happens. But if you sort of read between the lines, these are the four explanations that I'm going to have here are the ones that crop up most often. One is that FDR was ignorant and or sentimental about China, and this is what explains why he wanted it to be the fourth policeman. And the ignorance argument takes two actually contradictory variations. One is that he thought that the nationalist government was strong and therefore would be a powerful ally to have in the post-war world. And the other is that he thought that the nationalist government was so weak that it was going to be a puppet, essentially an American puppet, functions as an American puppet in the post-war world. I think none of this makes any sense. None of this dovetails with what we know about FDR's knowledge about China. He had excellent information and a fairly, for someone who was not a China expert, a fairly significant understanding of Chiang Kai-shek's personality, the nationalist regime's situation, the weakness of their domestic situation, the weakness of their military structure. There's absolutely no evidence to show that FDR didn't understand what was going on in China. And in fact, he says numerous times, and I'll show you a few quotes, but he says this numerous times, that China is weak militarily, it's weak politically, and he expected to remain, he was hoping that it will at least be politically united in the post-war world, but he expected it to remain weak militarily and economically for quite some time after the war ends. There was no expectation here that China, so, I mean, he did not think that China was actually a great power and therefore should be recognized as such. He was consciously making it into one with this core police. The sentimentality idea comes up a lot. I gave this talk at Harvard maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and one of the participants was a Boston lawyer who was a descendant of the Delano side of the FDR family tree, and he brought in a kind of handwritten diary by some Delano ancestor who had been to China. Many of the Delano ancestors, the important ones, were China traders in the 18th and 19th centuries. And FDR liked to mention that. And he was waving around this, the lawyer was waving, at the Q&A was waving around this diary and said, you know, FDR's great uncle was this China trader, and FDR grew up on his knee, and he, you know, on stories about China trade and so on and so forth. And this is why he wanted China to be among the four policemen. Well, FDR certainly liked to kind of play on these family connections, but I'm absolutely convinced that this was not the motivation. It was an easy way for him to explain, you know, my Delano ancestors, and that sort of thing. But you know, when you look at the way he thinks about this behind closed doors, the way he advocates for this behind closed doors, this is not a question of sentimentality for him. This is a question of strategic, central strategic significance. The second explanation that often comes up is the domestic opinion China lobby story. You know, there are lots of, and this is, in some sense, it's an extension of this sentimentality story to the American public. And at large, you know, the American public was sentimental about China. They saw the United States as China's protector, kind of patron-client relationship that they imagined there being. There was a lot of, many effective China lobbyists. Henry Luce is often mentioned in this connection. Madame Chiang Kai-shek and her brother, T.V. Song, who was the foreign minister of the nationalist government. And all of that is true. There was a strong China lobby. They were influential. But it's beside the point, there might have been other things that FDR did to make the China lobbyists happy, but this was not one of them. One, he started promoting this idea behind the scenes long before the China lobby started cranking up. Two, he kept this idea largely secret for as long as he could. This was not a public relation ploy. And third, FDR was ambivalent at best and actually quite dismissive of both Chiang Kai-shek and, no, dismissive is not the right word. He respected the fact that they were at the, you know, the leaders of nationalist China, but he didn't get along with either of them very well. He didn't like either of them very much. And I'm convinced that this was not about the Chiangs. That is, his insistence that China must be the fourth policeman was not about, you know, we need to have Chiang Kai-shek at the center of world order. It was about China as a concept, as a nation, as a country, and not about the particular political leadership. You know, after he meets, their only meeting in Cairo in 1943, fall of 1943, we have evidence that he says after he meets with Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek drives him crazy with all kinds of demands. He says, you know, I wouldn't mind if this guy was perhaps removed in a coup or something. It's the sort of thing that Kennedy later said about CM. So this was not about the Chiangs. The third explanation that comes up is wartime concerns. According to this, FDR was afraid that either that China would sign a separate peace with Japan, or that they would collapse under the, you know, their morale will collapse. He was concerned about those things. I think he wasn't as concerned as some of the advocates of this explanation think, but he certainly was concerned about those things. But again, this is an irrelevant explanation because there is no connection between making China a central component of the post-war order and bolstering the morale of the Chinese fighting force during the war. There are other things, again, that he did to do that. You know, his approval of Chennault's Flying Tigers and that sort of thing. I can certainly buy the explanation that had something to do with his desire to bolster Chinese morale. But this, and as I said before, Chiang himself was not particularly interested in this role. And when FDR approached him in Cairo and said, you know, would China like to take a leading role in the occupation, the Allied occupation of Japan post-war? Chiang demurs, and he says, well, you know, we're not quite ready for that. We have enough problems within China. We don't want to be the occupiers of Japan. And the fourth explanation, and this is the one that I think has something to it, but it's woefully incomplete, is that there was some kind of regional security balance that FDR imagined was necessary in East Asia, and that China was going to be central for that. That's essentially the Kissinger explanation. A lot of people to whom I mentioned this question say, well, of course, he wanted China to balance out. Well, they say either Japan or Russia or both in the post-war world. And I think there might be something into that, but I think but I think there's actually, the evidence shows that there's actually far less than you would think. And there's several reasons for this. First of all, it's very clear, and again, as I said before, it's very clear that FDR expected China to remain militarily weak for a long time after the war. So if this was going to be a military balance in East Asia, it was a very long-term thing. It was not something that was going to be in place, in his view, in 1945 or 1950. Maybe in 1970, that was going to be plausible. The other problem with this is that we tend to forget that inasmuch as FDR was worried about a major world power in East Asia in the post-war period, he was far more worried about the British than he was about the Russians. FDR, and I'm quite convinced of this, saw the British Empire as a bigger impediment to the sort of world order that US-led world order that he thought he wanted to construct after the war than the Soviet Union. That, to me, is pretty clear. We've tended to forget that. I had a big argument over this precise point with the taxi driver who dropped me here today from Austin. He told me that history, and as soon as he heard it, I was a historian. He said, "Oh, history is my passion, and my father was in World War II." And he reads military history, and I think that by the end of the ride, I managed to convince him that there was something about the British Empire that bothered FDR. But I think it's something we tend to forget. Part of the reason we tend to forget this is a lot of the writing, actually, a lot of our understanding of FDR's thought processes, as it comes through the literature, comes from British authors. If you look at even someone as, I think, really insightful as Bob Dallek, a lot of the stuff that he quotes, because that's what there is from Halifax and from Eden and from Churchill telling us what FDR thought. Because FDR was not nice enough to tell us himself as historians. And of course, Churchill wrote much of this stuff, the famous dictum. He wrote much of this stuff himself. But even other historians who are trying to get into FDR's head, they find that the British sources are the most available. And so a lot of this stuff is actually not what FDR thought. It's what Halifax thought that FDR thought. It's what Eden thought that FDR thought. It's what Churchill thought that FDR thought. And so this is actually, I think, quite profound hostility to the British Empire gets significantly downplayed in this story. All right, I've spoken enough. Now let me introduce to you what I think is the most useful frame to think about this question, try to answer this question when I start. I think we have to, in order to put this in the right frame, we have to remember two things about two aspects of FDR's strategic thought. One of them is that FDR was a Wilsonian. And when I said there are various different ways to define this, part of his Wilsonianism was what I call historical Wilsonianism, meaning he wanted to learn lessons from Wilson's mistakes. And a lot of the way he conducts his strategy in World War II is based on trying to fix what he thought Wilson got wrong. But the other part of his Wilsonianism was ideological. And at the core of this ideology was a view of global security based on an international organization of collective security that would deter aggression through a graduated process. First arbitration, then economic sanctions, and then finally, as a last resort, military intervention. Now, who would do this military intervention? That's what the four policemen are for. And he's very clear about this. He says, the four policemen will be the only powers who would have the right to use legitimate force in the international arena. All the other powers will be disarmed. And when he first says this to Molotov, when he first meets Molotov in the Soviet foreign minister in May of 1942, Molotov says, well, what about France? And FDR says, disarmed. So this is a fairly radical position, but he wants China to be one of those four countries that has a legitimate right to use military force to deter aggression. That's one piece. The second piece that's important to remember, and not often remembered, is FDR's anti-colonialism. I think was a passionate opponent of territorial, what we would call territorial imperialism. And you can line up any number of quotes of what he had to say about, particularly about the imperial record of the French, but also about the imperial record of the British. It's very clear that he is adamant that the European territorial empires must be dismantled in the post-war war. They could be dismantled gradually to some extent. For that, they set up the trusteeship system and so on and so forth. But the big piece is actually he wants to have dismantled very quickly. He wants, for example, he pushes Churchill on the question of Indian independence, and he wants him to promise Indians independence during the war, to be implemented immediately after. And of course, Churchill hears nothing of it, is not willing to hear it, and so FDR begins to do this with various emissaries that he sends and so on. He doesn't give up the goal, but he doesn't push it directly with Churchill again. It's clear that that's what he wants to happen. And the British Empire without India is not much of an empire. They discovered after the end of the war. Sharp critic of European empires and consistent pressure on Britain. Now, both of these things are, to FDR scholars, they're fairly well known. I think on the second aspect, Warren Kimball is especially strong. But I've never seen anyone apply these two aspects of FDR's strategic worldview to the question of why China, which is the question for us today. Why is China the fourth policeman? And I make the argument that China's role as a fourth policeman is best explained in light of the intersection of Wilsonianism and FDR's Wilsonianism and his anti-colonialism. That is, he envisioned an order in which non-white peoples in general would no longer be part of European empires. They would be sovereign, self-determining actors in world affairs. And if they were going to be sovereign, self-determining actors, they needed to be part of the system that he was constructing. And if they were going to be part of the system, they needed to be, at least have a solid representation at the very top rung of that system, the fourth policeman. And so I actually make the argument that China, that FDR's pursuit of China as the fourth policeman is certainly not about Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek. It's not even about China per se, as big as China is. It is about the integration of non-white peoples into the post-war world order. And China is the biggest, in his view, the most important, the most plausible candidate to represent this kind of integration. And therefore, he wants it to be. Now, there are all sorts of ways, and we can talk about the legacies of this particular insistence, but the most obvious legacy is that FDR's insistence on China's inclusion as a fourth policeman is the single thing that gets China into the permanent memberships of the permanent membership of the Security Council of the United Nations, United Nations Security Council, when it gets set up in 1944-45. And those of you who followed recent decades, any of the efforts to reform or expand the permanent memberships of the permanent membership of the UN Security Council will know, had China not gotten in at that stage in 1944-45, it probably would not be in there today. They've tried to add India, they've tried to add Germany. It's basically impossible to do, and they failed. And so the reason China is on the Security Council today, the reason that the Chinese have a voice in this top rung of global governance, is because of FDR's insistence that they must be among the four policemen. All right. And as I said, I'm not going to present a smoking gun, but I am going to show you some dots, which I think are most convincingly connected with this explanation. First of all, I want to just start by showing you, by reminding you, I'm sure all of you know this, but by reminding you that by even making the argument in 1941 that China was a great power, FDR was breaking with at least a century of common understandings of how international affairs worked. China had not been treated as a great power for at least 100 years. This is a seating chart that I found a long time ago, but I still really like it. It's the seating chart of the plenary of the Paris Peace Conference that followed the First World War. And the nice thing, I mean, the plenary didn't really do anything significant in terms of negotiating the treaties that came out of the Paris Peace Conference. This is 1919. But it's a pictorial, graphic representation of the international hierarchy. If any of you have ever been to a Chinese banquet, you know that people's importance is imputed by where they sit, right? And this is very explicit. So, you know, the same in international diplomacy. So you have the chair, you know, Clemenceau here, the French Prime Minister. The most important people sit to the chair's right, as I'm sure you know. So that's the American delegation, President Wilson, and the rest of them. Second most important to the chair's left. This is Lloyd George and the British delegation. The French are here, the Japanese are here. There's also a number of seats. So it's a number of seats and location. The big powers have 5 seats each. The big fives have 5 seats each. And other powers have fewer seats depending on their status. So where's China in this story? Well, China is right here on the inside of the table. They have 2 seats, and they're seated between Bolivia on one side and Ecuador on the other. So this is, I think, a very clear representation of China's international status in 1919, and China appealed to the peace conference. Even in their own rhetoric, they said, we as a small nation are asking, you know, this, they said, well, this war was fought for the rights of small nations like Belgium, so we are also a small nation, therefore we should be given at least as many rights as Belgium. Right? So I'm not, you know, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I think even in the 1920s and 30s, the Washington Conference, and after the Japanese invasions and occupations in 31 and then 37, China is never treated as a great power. The war between, until the United States joined the war between Japan and China, or really the Japanese invasion of China, is never treated as a war between 2 great powers. It's essentially treated in a way that's analogous to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. That is to say, an invasion by a major power of a backward nation or state. That, you know, we are sentimental for it. We should talk a great deal about how we should. It shouldn't be invaded, just like Ethiopia was talked about, but we're not actually going to do anything about it. So FDR's insistence in this context is counterintuitive. Now, the next couple of dots, or a few dots that I'm going to mention is that FDR's advocacy of China as the 4th policeman was both central to his strategy and also persistent throughout the war, from 41 to 45. Actually, right after Pearl Harbor, the Americans and the British in particular, but also negotiating with the Russians, begin to work on what becomes the Declaration of the United Nations. This is a sort of declaration of principles that is devised in late December of 1941, that is literally a couple weeks after Pearl Harbor, and then released with great fanfare on the 1st of January 1942. And it's a very general declaration of principle, and it's interesting. I looked at the negotiations over this, and discussions, internal discussions within the administration. FDR had some comments on the content. His most important contribution or insistence was the inclusion of religious freedom as one of the principles that the United Nations as were fighting for, and he also coined the term United Nations, which kind of got around the fact that Americans didn't like to be allied to anyone. But it's interesting, when you look at it, I have the document right here, when you look at his, in his memo to the Secretary of State about the changes he wants in the draft of this declaration, most of those comments are not about the content of the declaration, but about the signatories. Who should be allowed to sign, who shouldn't be allowed to sign, and how to arrange the names, this order of names. And he says a couple of interesting things. Three interesting things, actually, I want to mention. First, he says, China and the USSR should be lifted from alphabetical order and put on top with the United States and Great Britain. So already he's creating this club of four that's separate from all the other, there were 26 signatories. Separate, all the others were in alphabetical order. Then he says, number two, he says, I think it's really important to get to pressure the British to allow India to sign as a separate signature. And he succeeds in this, they allow it. And the third thing he says is the French should not be allowed to sign. So France is not there. And the more you learn about FDR, the more you appreciate the depth of his contempt for the French. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. So this is how it looks pictorially. This is put out by the Office of War Information very soon afterwards. And this represents the flags of the signatories of the Declaration of the United Nations. They fight for freedom, of course. And you can see here the four great powers out of alphabetical order, and then you get to start alphabetical order: Australia, Belgium, and so on and so forth. India is there, right here, represented. France, nowhere to be found. So already, weeks after Pearl Harbor, he says, China has to be up there with the great powers. When he meets with Molotov, as I said, in May of 1942, Molotov, of course, famously arrives in D.C. Carrying in a suitcase a loaf of black Russian bread, a big Russian sausage, and a revolver for self-defense. He's a big proponent of the Second Amendment. And he wants to talk about the war. He wants to talk about the opening of a second front. That's what Stalin and Molotov are concerned about. But FDR starts a discussion by talking about the post-war order. And immediately he says to Molotov, we're going to have this structure. The four policemen are going to be dissenter. They're going to have the right to preserve world peace, to use force in international affairs. All the others are not going to have that right. They're going to be demilitarized. That's where he says, France included. And Molotov twice actually asks him, why are you putting China? And he says to him, these are the four. And he says, why are you putting China? China is weak. And FDR kind of concedes. He says, yeah, China will have to have a united government to do this. He concedes that they're weak, but he doesn't concede the point that they shouldn't be there. He keeps pushing it. Molotov doesn't resist too hard because that's not his priority. His priority is to talk about the second front, to try to get a commitment from FDR to do that, to relieve the pressure on the Eastern Front. But it's quite interesting that it comes up right there. China is there from the very beginning of the concept of the fourth policeman. Now, as I mentioned, the Allies resist this. Churchill has this famous quote where he says, I cannot regard the Chunking government as representing great world power. Certainly there would be a faggot vote on the side of the United States in any attempt to liquidate the British Empire, British overseas empire. So Churchill's actually right about this. The Chunking government does not represent a world power at this point in time. And it would be a faggot vote on anything having to do with liquidating the British Empire, although this quote has been, in some texts, has been taken out of context. This term "faggot vote," which is, especially for Americans, is kind of very, appealing. It has been used to suggest that Churchill thought that China would be an American puppet. But that's not what he's saying here. He's not saying there'll be an American puppet on everything. He's saying there'll be an American ally liquidating the British Empire, which is precisely true. And Churchill, I think, realized better than many of us do today that was one of FDR's goals: to liquidate the British Empire. And that China would be an ally, not a puppet, but an ally in this task. So this quote has been taken out of context, I think, and used to imply that Churchill thought that China was going to be an American puppet, and moving it even a bit further, used to say that FDR thought that China was going to be an American puppet. And I think neither of these things are even remotely true. Churchill didn't think it. Certainly FDR. Stalin, also consistent, he was not one for saucy quotes, but he was just as stubborn as Churchill. He certainly was refused consistently to meet with any Chinese representative, not just personally, but you know, in any official form, and continuously resisted this idea. But I'll get in a minute to how the Americans essentially compelled the Soviets to accept this China as a fortress. Then, as I said before, Chiang Kai-shek was himself not. He had ambitions, of course, in East Asia, but he didn't really understand it. And was not particularly interested in the sort of global role that FDR envisioned for China in the post-war world. And I'll get in a minute to this distinction between the global and the regional aspects of this. Now, I'm sure you know that the first meeting between the big three happens in Tehran in November of 1943, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR. And in preparation for that meeting, as I'm sure you also know, there was a foreign ministers conference in Moscow in October of 1943 to prepare Tehran, prepare the summit in Tehran. And so Molotov is there, Cordell Hull, who's the U.S. Secretary of State, is there. Anthony Eden, who's the British Secretary of State or Foreign Minister, is there. And the Americans wanted the Chinese Foreign Minister invited as well, but of course Stalin refused, and so he was not invited. But the interesting thing about this, and this I actually have to read, is that Avril Harriman went with Cordell Hull to this meeting. He'd just been appointed American ambassador to the Soviet Union, and so he goes to take up his position, and he serves as an advisor to Hull during these negotiations. And this is from Hull's sort of autobiography. It's autobiography, although it's written in the third person. So what he basically says here is that Hull spent most of his time, most of his discussions with Molotov. They wanted to have a declaration coming out of the Moscow meeting that will prepare, a declaration of principle that will prepare the Tehran summit. This declaration is known as the Four Nations Declaration. It's basically an expansion of the earlier Declaration of the United Nations, Declaration of Principle. And the Russians and the British want it to be a three-nation declaration. They don't want China to be allowed to sign. And the Americans insist on China being allowed to sign. And first, Molotov tries to hide behind a technicality. He says, well, the Chinese foreign minister is not here, so how can they sign? Of course, he's not here, he's not invited, but Hull says, well, we'll have the Chinese ambassador sign. Molotov keeps up putting in front. Hull, according to Harriman, spends most of the week of negotiations pushing back against this, and in the end, he essentially threatens that if the Russians do not agree to allow the Chinese to sign this Declaration of Principles, Lend-Lease aid would be taken away from Russia, some portion of it would be taken away from Russia and moved to China. At that point, Molotov gets a signal from Stalin that it's okay, that we can allow the Chinese to sign. So he was expending a lot of capital vis-a-vis the Russians, but he was also Hull and Roosevelt behind him were also going against the advice of their newly appointed ambassador. This is now the quote from Harriman. From Harriman's point of view, Hull's concentration on the declaration and China was a mistake. He used all of his influence, the ambassador recalled, to get China accepted as the fourth great power. I thought he would have been better advised also to apply his considerable leverage with the Russians, Lend-Lease leverage, in attempting to work out agreements to safeguard the independence of Poland and other nations in Eastern and Central Europe whose liberation was foreseen in a matter of months. Eden stood alone, however, the British Prime Minister, in raising that issue. Molotov predictably contended that it was too early to talk about Eastern Europe, and Hull, in spite of Harriman's urgings, was not greatly interested. One day in Moscow, when Harriman stressed the cardinal importance of pressing Molotov to talk about Poland, the Secretary of State responded, and this is, when I saw this quote, I was flabbergasted. The Secretary of State responded, I don't want to deal with these piddling little things. We must deal with the main issues. This is quite striking. Getting China to sign the declaration, that's the main issue. That's what he thought he should be spending most of his leverage on. Worrying about Poland, that's a piddling little thing. And I think, in a sense, that is to my mind, a clearer representation of the priorities of Roosevelt and Hull, not everyone in the administration, but Roosevelt and Hull, than what some of the historiography would lead us to believe. There's a lot of big debates over whether at Yalta FDR sold Poland down the river or not, whether he had any choice or not. I think all of these are crucial debates, but I think the main point is that Poland was just not particularly important. I mean, I'm convinced by the argument he didn't really have much leverage on the question of Poland, but even if he had leverage, like he did in Moscow, he would not have used it for that, because it just wasn't a priority. China was a priority. When FDR ends up, sorry, this is the Chinese ambassador who signs the four-nation, in the Soviet Union signs the four-nation declaration. When FDR meets next month, or actually a couple weeks later, meets Stalin in Tehran, again, the first thing, just like the Molotov, the first thing he wants to talk about is the Postal Order. This is actually how he draws it out. Some of you may have seen this before. He draws it out for Stalin. This is what the international organization of the Postal Order is going to look like. So I don't, I would have drawn these circles as concentric. Maybe he was graphically challenged, but that's how he draws it. You have here 3 circles. This is what becomes essentially the General Assembly of the United Nations. It says 40 United Nations. It ended up being more than that. I think 52 at the beginning, and of course by now, maybe more than that. This is the Executive Committee, which what essentially evolves into what is now known as the various specialized agencies and the Social and Economic Council, all those parts of the UN that deal with non-security matters. And he puts, the ILO. Many of these organizations are already there, either in full or in their grounding form of the League of Nations. And then here on the right side is the 4 policemen. That's the security part of the architecture. That's what's going to take care of preserving the peace. This is kind of if you want, the New Deal part of the global order. It's globalizing the New Deal. It's going to take care of social and economic issues. And this is like the parliament, where everybody's going to be represented, and hopefully not muck stuff up too much. I mean, it's kind of like FDR's attitude toward domestic affairs, just translated into the global stage. Now, there is actually quite a discussion, an interesting discussion between FDR and Stalin about this. I mean, again, this is not a priority for Stalin, so he doesn't spend too much time talking about this. He wants to talk about this. But he does challenge China's inclusion in the 4 policemen. And he says to him, Stalin says, when FDR says China is one of the 4 policemen, and Stalin says, well, the way he puts this is this. He says, I don't know if the small European nation, and the FDR basically says if there's going to be a threat to peace, the 4 policemen will work together to meet that threat. And the FDR and Stalin says, I don't know if a small European nation would want the Chinese to be involved in their business. So he says, let's have 2 separate councils. One council for Europe, where China's not involved. One council for East Asia, where China is involved. So that they don't muck up, European affairs. This is the regional structure idea. And actually, this had a lot of support even within the administration. Sumner Welles, among other people, supported it. Stalin supported it. Churchill supported it. But the globalists, FDR, first among them, but also Cordell Hull, in the end succeed in creating a structure for the United Nations which is not regional, which is global. And FDR says to Stalin right there in Tehran, he says to him, no, this can't be a regional structure. This must be a global structure. And so this to me is another dot, another piece of evidence that what he's concerned about is not simply the balance of power in East Asia. What he's concerned about when he's thinking about China as a 4 policeman. Not simply a balance of power in East Asia, because for that, the regional structure would have been okay. He doesn't really want the Chinese to be involved, say, in conflicts in the Balkans. But he needs China there at the global level for symbolic reasons. The global nature of the United Nations, among other things, the Security Council, what becomes Security Council, is crucial for the symbolism, for the representational value of it. It's not simply a question of security in the narrow sense of the term. And this insistence on the global writ of the Security Council for policemen, becomes Security Council, continues throughout and essentially, and in the end, triumphs, at least in the way that the organization is. So I've talked more than enough already. Conclusions. FDR's insistence on China's inclusion in the 4th policeman was persistent and central to his plans for the Postal Order. He It is best explained as emerging from the intersection of his Wilsonian advocacy of military security's opposition to colonialism. The post-war order would be based on the vision would be based on the colonial empires, the gradual integration of non-white peoples as sovereign equals in international society, and an international organization of global and not just regional scope with the legitimate power of economic sanction of military action. And for all of this, you needed China. Chinese membership in the post-war Big Four was crucial to this particular security architecture as a symbol of the integration of non-white peoples in international society and the global legitimacy and authority of the United Nations. And there are numerous quotes I could give you that show that FDR was insisting that he was thinking about this in the long term. This was a grand strategic, to coin a term, a grand strategic move rather than a tactical move. One of them is from a letter he wrote to Louis Mountbatten, who was the Supreme Commander of the China-Burma-India theater for the war, the British Admiral. And Mountbatten asks him about the inclusion of China. He says, "I really feel it as a triumph to have got the 425 million Chinese on the Allied side. This will be very useful 25 or 50 years hence, even though China cannot contribute military or naval support for the moment." This is interesting, among other things, because he was out of date in terms of Chinese population. This number, he either says 400 or 425 million. Actually, the actual number by this time was something like 525. And I was interested in why he keeps quoting the wrong number. So I looked it up, and I realized that it was around 400 million. The Chinese population was around 400 million around the time that FDR graduated from Harvard. And so presumably, I don't know, he picked that number up somewhere. Like we all pick up intellectual capital and then we spend it, like Kissinger said. So he was spending his intellectual capital that he picked up a couple decades ago. And by that time, but nevertheless, I mean, for him it was still a big number. So if he had used the actual number, would have been even more impressive, I suppose. I'm really interested in the 25-year figure that he puts there, because I have a brief coda, if you'll bear with me. I want to make the argument, and this I think goes a bit against perhaps substantially against the current historiography, that the Marshall Mission in 1946 was essentially a continuation, or an attempt by the Truman administration to continue FDR's policy on the China question. And to construct a kind of China that would do what FDR wanted it to do, which is at the very least a united China. Now, I hadn't realized until I looked at this, maybe you know this, but I was surprised to learn this. I knew about the Marshall Mission. I hadn't realized that Marshall was in China, George Marshall was in China for more than a year. He arrived there in late 1945. He didn't leave until early 1947. And I was struck by this because in most histories that you read of the origins of the Cold War, this is kind of a footnote. Marshall went to China, he tried to negotiate between the Chinese and between the nationalists and the communists. It was, doomed from the start. He failed, he left, and that was it. The Cold War broke out. And the Civil War in China broke out. But he was there for 14 months. This is not some piddly little thing, right? To send someone of Marshall's stature, spent such a long time in China. And he comes back from China in February to Washington, February 1947. He immediately gets appointed Secretary of State. His next major act in the summer of 1947 is the Marshall Plan. And to me, it's really interesting, this move from the Marshall Mission to the Marshall Plan. Not just this move from a FDR Wilsonian mode of trying to construct order to a Cold War mode. There's a complete shift in the way that the American government is viewing how it needs to reconstruct the world order. But also a shift from focus on East Asia to a focus on Europe. Marshall starts spending 14 months in East Asia trying to gives up on that, moves on to Europe. So this move from the Marshall Mission to the Marshall Plan is actually quite an interesting move for me, and I think cuts against the grain of some of our understandings of the origins of the Cold War. I was saying this at Yale a few weeks ago, and John Gaddis was thinking that. I was like, am I really challenging, the historiography and the origins of the Cold War, and John Gaddis is sitting right in front of me. But I said it anyway, and he seemed to think it was an interesting idea. It's something I'm now exploring. And the next paper I want to write is on the Marshall Mission. I think it's been overlooked as an important turning point of lens. But the interesting thing is, so Marshall leaves China in early 1947. Now, FDR was talking about 25 years hence. What happens 25 years after Marshall leaves China? Another significant American official arrives. Anybody know? It's too easy, right? You're all well educated. February of 1972, 25 years, almost exactly. Not to the day. Would have been nice to the day, but almost exactly after Marshall leaves, Nixon arrives. And I think it actually makes sense, at least to me, it makes sense to see what Nixon was doing in 1972 as, in some sense, returning to the Rooseveltian strategy, returning to the notion that China is central in American global strategy. Not just about East Asia or about the Cold War, but to American global strategy. I'll leave you with that tomorrow. Thank you.
Taking questions.
Jeremy.
So I want to push you, Erez. This is a wonderful talk, but I want to push you on why the balance of power explanation isn't a better explanation, right? But you've shown most of your evidence, and I want to believe what you're arguing, because, as you know, I agree that FDR takes anti-colonialism very seriously, and certainly think you're dead on. FDR's not just criticism, or visceral hatred of the British Empire. So that all makes sense. But most of the evidence you show actually seems more persuasive, with FDR's also considerable interest in containing Soviet power, as well as the power of the British Empire. And China is an independent China that can act strongly on the international scene is an obvious solution to that problem. And your coda, in a certain way, undercuts your argument. Because it would be hard to argue that Nixon in '72 is looking for...
So, problem solved. Yeah, no, go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, but you hear my point. I mean, I want to hear you say a little more, not about why FDR wanted a non-white society to play a major role, but why that's a better explanation than the balance of power explanation.
Actually, if I can, I was going to ask a similar question, but it's slight revisions. If I can jump in here, since it's a sort of theme. I'm persuaded by the Wilsonian influence very much. But what about the influence of Roosevelt's fifth cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, and his realism there? Not so much a geopolitical realism of China as a nation-state balancing in East Asia, but the fusion of the UN of Wilsonian idealism and then realism of the four policemen. Why not China as an institutional balance to the other three veto-wielding members of the Security Council, so that it doesn't have to be the US playing off the British against the Soviets all the time, but that China can help sometimes balance the Soviets institutionally, sometimes balance the British. It's a modification of Jeremy's question, but it's the same balancing dynamic.
Yeah. All right. Where to start? First of all, I think you're right that the sort of regional strategic argument is the one that's the hardest job that I have to convince my audience readers that my explanation connects the dots better. A couple of the dots that I think, and I mentioned this in the talk, a couple of the dots that I think don't really get connected by the regional explanation is, again, FDR's insistence on the global structure. And his continued rejection, it would have been easy for him to accept the regional structure because both Stalin wanted it, Churchill wanted it, and some of the most influential people within his administration wanted it. That was one of the main points of contention between Sumner Welles and Orville Hull. Including some who were convinced internationalists, but thought that it made more sense strategically to have these things happen regionally, to have, sort of, as you say, a combination of idealism and realism. I think FDR's is also, I mean, I'm not one of those who thinks that Wilsonianism is somehow a counterpoint to realism. I actually think that Wilsonians see themselves and are motivated by what they perceive as exigencies. They don't perceive, certainly FDR does not perceive himself as trying to kind of impose a messianic or utopian view. He saw himself, I believe, as maybe Wilson did, but FDR more obviously. As someone who was responding to the world as it was, who was responding to things like what his generation would call the rising tide of color, and the inevitability of it. I haven't talked about whether Wilkie's book on World, I think that's a really interesting document in that way. So I think the global aspect is one argument, one dot that I would make that doesn't really get connected.
Why does that cut more the other way rather than in terms of a global balance? I mean, that would.
Well, I mean, because as I understand it, the purely strategic argument says China would have been useful for counterbalancing the British and the Russians in East Asia. Certainly not in Europe, in East Asia. So that's the argument that has to do with the strategic balance in East Asia. And the regional idea that, again, both Stalin and Churchill supported would have resolved that issue. Or it seems to, I think it would have resolved that issue in FDR's mind. And so the fact that he rejected it and pursued this global structure and insisted that China, at least symbolically, should be involved in all security problems globally, not just East Asian security problems, by the virtue of its membership in the Four Policemen. To me, that dot gets connected better with my explanation than with this other one. The other dot is that it's very clear that FDR understood, this was again realistic, that China was not going to be a major military power anytime in the foreseeable future. That it was not going to be on its own, going to be able to resist Soviet military power and or Japanese military power. And so if you want to make the argument that he thought that China in 1945 was going to be a major power that was going to hold off the Japanese, hold off the Soviets, was not going to happen, and there's no evidence that he thought it was going to happen. And the fact that he was very clear-eyed about the current weakness of China, and yet so insistent on its inclusion as a great power, essentially its promotion, this unearned promotion in Churchill's terms to this rank of great powers, to me requires an explanation that looks at the symbolic value of this move, not simply the strategic value.
Unless he had no alternative. If he needs a balancer, and that's all he's got.
Well,
Who would
but
be
if the balancer, but
Who would balance better?
well, obviously the balancer is going to be the United States. It was clear the United States was going to be the main occupier of Japan, and it was clear that was going to be a long-term mission.
Yeah.
And 25 years hence, China would be useful, in his view, in that mission. This was not going to be an immediate thing, and again, pushing against all this resistance, pushing against the Russian resistance, pushing against the British resistance, putting all this capital into this notion of having China sign the Foreign Nation Declaration, having them included in Dumbarton Oaks, having them included in San Francisco as a founding member of the security of the permanent members of the Security Council. It would have been much easier for him to deprioritize that. Say, all right, I'm going to give it to trade it for something with Churchill or with Stalin and with Wilkie. And yet he didn't. It was clearly a very high priority for him. And I don't think that China's usefulness as a military power in East Asia explains enough of that insistence. I'm not saying that the East Asia strategic argument is worthless. I just don't think that on its own it is enough to explain what it's trying to do. About Nixon, I'll put him back on because I didn't say about Nixon, and I haven't done much research into Nixon, and so I'm saying this only as a suggestive rather than definitive. But you say it's hard to. I think you started saying it's hard to imagine Nixon as kind of being this Wilsonian idealist who's trying to. But I'm sure you know this. Actually, Nixon worshipped Wilson. When Nixon came to the White House, he brought in Wilson's desk to be his own presidential desk. Nixon was the son of a Quaker pacifist mother, and I'm kind of developing a psychological theory here. Sitting in his. Nixon was about 6, I think, in 1919, and it's clear that Nixon's. He has these speeches where he talks about his president. He talks about the title of peacemaker as being the greatest title that anyone can have. He actually makes references to Wilson. There's I forget which speech it was. His famous speech at the beginning of his presidency where he says, ever since he basically puts himself in Wilson's shoes in the Wilsonian tradition, and paints his effort to end the Vietnam War, for example, but also to promote world peace in general as a Wilsonian mission. Now, so he explicitly does that. He explicitly makes that connection. We don't tend to think of Nixon in those terms these days for all sorts of reasons. I think it may not be as silly as it seems at first. It may not take us all the way, but I think it's certainly worth trying to see if the shoe fits. And trying to figure out what Nixon was doing. You can be a crook and a malevolent guy and also at the same time be an idealist and try to achieve world peace. I don't see this as, people contain multitudes.
I'm positive about one thing, and that's the colonialism, anti-colonialism argument. Granted, FDR was definitely for self-determination, the colonial, former colonial countries, but, and he did pressure the British on India, but he didn't do a thing about the French. Why not? He hated the French. He didn't dislike the French. He hated de Gaulle. De Gaulle is, of all my crosses, the cross of Lorraine is the greatest to bear. He hated the way the French were operating in Southeast Asia, but he did nothing to suppress or to get de Gaulle out of Southeast Asia. We had people in Hanoi working with Ho Chi Minh at the end of the war. Ho Chi Minh indications are, would have come to the U.S. side if we had supported him against the French. FDR rejected this. Why?
Well, I have a feeling that you and other people in the room may know this particular history better than I do, but I'll tell you what my sense is, and if I'm wrong about this, tell me. Obviously, this entire area is occupied by the Japanese throughout the war. FDR, I think, is very clear that he is dead opposed to giving this back to the French when the war is over. He supports the American work with Ho Chi Minh. In fact, when Ho Chi Minh declares independence, that famous declaration where he cites from Thomas Jefferson, there are American officers standing right next to him on the stage. I mean, he's an ally. He's an explicit ally of the Americans at this point. And my understanding is that the decision in the end, to support the French is a decision that's made long after FDR is dead. It's a decision made by the Truman administration very reluctantly, and basically because of the French blackmail. And the French basically say, look, if we lose our empire, we might go communist. So what do you prefer? Do you prefer to support these Vietnamese, or are you willing to take the risk that as a price for that you have the Russians and the French Communist Party winning elections in France? And Truman actually thinks long and hard about this. This isn't an obvious, it's not a reflexive, yes, of course we'll support you, but at the end, and Fred Logevall has written about this more eloquently than anyone else. By the early 1950s, the Americans are more or less all in. But this isn't FDR's. As I understand it, this is not FDR's doing at all. I mean, if somebody has a different understanding, I'd love to hear. Yeah, and back.
I'm struggling to grapple with the end of this policy because it seems like it ends pretty abruptly, and I think it's clear that though Truman was not as informed as perhaps he should have been as vice president of Roosevelt's foreign policy goals, if the inclusion of China in the upper echelon of the world powers was as important to Roosevelt as you're arguing, it would seem to me that this would have been passed on to Truman, who I think it's clear from Wilson Miss Campbell's work and others was trying to carry on Roosevelt's foreign policy. And if Roosevelt was willing to do something as dramatic as cancel or diminish lend lease to the Soviet Union in the middle of World War II, yeah, you would think that there would be a willingness to expend similar political capital later. And while I don't discount a 14-month mission by a very senior figure in American policymaking circles, it does seem that the U.S., if this was that important, could have done so much more.
Yeah. First of all, I have to say that at this stage, the priority, the question of FDR, the importance FDR is attached to China's role, to me, is less of an argument than a fact. I mean, I just see it as, my argument is to explain why. I mean, that's where the argument part comes in. But I would say this. I mean, this is sort of the next stage of my project. This is where I look at the Marshall Mission. So everything I say about this is extremely tentative. Don't hold me to it if it doesn't hold up. But and this gets into this very complicated and interlinked, origins of the Cold War story. How we really transition from the Rooseveltian vision into the Cold War order, which we know now is more of an interlude, but a very long and influential interlude. Right? So even under FDR, so I mean, FDR obviously thinks he can work with Stalin, not just during the war, but also after the war. FDR has no problem really with the Chinese communists, and even under FDR, there are lots of attempts to, and not just attempts, but missions to negotiations with the communists, attempts to bridge the gap between the nationalists and the communists, to bring them into a united front. And actually, Stalin supports this because Stalin's policy in terms of China is united front. He says to Mao, you should be together with these nationalists because that's the principle of united front. And of course, Mao understands Chinese realities much better than Stalin does. But actually, Roosevelt and Stalin are on the same page in this. And Truman continues this. The Marshall Mission is a continuation of, FDR worries a lot about trying to get a unified and stable government in China during the war. And the Marshall Mission is essentially a continuation of that, trying to do that, because he knows that in order for China to do what he wants it to do in this story that I just told you, it needs to have a united government. It may not necessarily have to be a major military or industrial power immediately, but it needs to be a stable power. Okay? Now what happens is, and this is already complicated in FDR's time, but it becomes more complicated in the early Truman administration. It becomes increasingly difficult to do anything that smells of pro-communist sympathies. Already under FDR, and then 46, 47, the internal arena hardens up, and it becomes less and less possible for an American politician to be seen or put oneself in a position of being tarred as pro-communist. And so Marshall, I think, comes in taking the Chinese communists very seriously and wants to work with them, but midway through his mission, one of the problems is the Chinese themselves are not, Chiang Kai-shek is allergic to any kind of compromise, and Mao himself is very mistrustful of Chiang Kai. But by around midpoint of the mission, it becomes more and more difficult for someone like Marshall to really operate with the communists in good faith, politically, in terms of the domestic repercussions of this. And because of I think we all know this story of the origin of the Cold War, and so what happens is it gets eaten up in the deepening and hardening divide between the Soviet Union and the United States. But at the same time, I'm actually, well, not convinced, but I think it's worth exploring the notion that for FDR and even for Truman at the beginning, East Asia was more important than Europe in terms of an arena for American interests. And this thing that I was hinting at from the Marshall Mission to the Marshall Plan, I think this is kind of a transition, not just transition from a Wilsonian order to, or Rooseveltian order to a Cold War order, but also a transition from a focus on East Asia to a focus on Europe. East Asia is essentially, by 47, it's clear that the nationalists are losing, they're going to lose the war, they haven't lost yet. Now, of course, this is, again, also an interlude, because then Korea comes along and East Asia again becomes a central arena of the Cold War. But by 47, they basically give up on making China, early 47, on making China what FDR wanted it to be for two reasons. One is because they can't fix the domestic Chinese situation, and two is the global situation becomes just not conducive to doing what they were trying to do. But there's a real effort, I think, initially to get a compromise between Mao and China. Yeah.
And this is the last question.
So, independent of the real politics we talked about, power politics we talked about earlier, and whether FDR thought that China was going to lean communist or nationalist, I thought your point of Wilsonism and how FDR thought about including non-whites in the creation of the United Nations that would legitimize it. That maybe, I don't know if you came across any research during where FDR thought about the failure of the League of Nations and whether he had that in mind when he included China as something that would last.
Yeah, I mean, FDR certainly thought about the failure of the League of Nations. I haven't found a specific one where he says the League of Nations failed because there was no room for non-white people in it. But I think it's a fairly reasonable assumption to make. He was clearly concerned. I mean, there's a great quote from FDR where he says, he talks about Churchill in China. He says, you know, Winston calls he talks about, he calls the Chinese, he calls them Chinamen and pigtails, and he's wrong about this. You know, they're serious people. They don't like to be called these kinds of names. They have a great deal of potential, and they'll be an important power at one point. And you know, I mean, Churchill, there's another quote from Churchill's doctor from his memoirs. Churchill was basically a Victorian. He was a racist through and through. He thought anybody who was not white was inferior, period. And I'm not saying FDR was a great egalitarian, but he was far more progressive than certainly than Churchill on this count. He thought that from a realist point of view, non-white peoples had to have room made for them in international affairs, or else the whole thing will fall apart.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Erez.